To start this journey today, let us begin in the way that we believe all leaders in business should start, by looking at the wider context and the big external forces that we can't always control, but that affect us all, and often in very different ways. This year, in the midst of a major war in Europe, an energy crisis, an economic crisis, and the growing existential threat of climate change, new words have entered our vocabularies: polycrisis, permacrisis. Our purpose is to try to make sense of this backdrop, to understand the different ways it affects us and how we can adapt. And to help us understand these forces, I have the privilege to welcome our keynote speaker, the Financial Times chief economics commentator, Martin Wolf, a multi-award-winning journalist, and one of the world's most influential voices in financial journalism. Martin, welcome to the Learning Exchange.
Well, I'm delighted to be here and to participate in this exciting venture. What I'm going to try to do in the next 25 minutes is talk about where the world is, how it got here, and where it might be going. So it's going to be a very big picture story about a very important period of history. And I call the period that we got to as a result of the developments I'm going to talk about it, a hinge moment in history. I think this decade is one of those really important moments in history. We have to understand why and how we got here. So let me start there with the period from 1978 to 2007. So why did I start in that period? Well, the reason is that in 1978, Deng Xiaoping became the leader of China. And that meant that, in a way, nobody at the time expected China was going to embark on an extraordinary experiment. And it led to what I think is the most important economic development in the world since the Industrial Revolution itself, namely the sudden transformation of China into, and it's sudden, 40 years, into a superpower from being a completely marginalized, self-isolated, but also isolated country. This was followed, of course, with the election of Margaret Thatcher in the UK in 1979 and Ronald Reagan in 1980. And we got what sometimes is called neoliberalism, and might be called the new market economy, and of course, globalization. So one of the consequences of this was the move to globalization and the development of a integrated world economy. This was, in fact, became, and to a large extent still is, far and away the most integrated world economy there has been in history. The only exception is the movement of people. If you look at the movement of goods across frontiers, by 2007, more or less the end of this period when the financial crisis hit, the trade in ratio to goods was twice as high as it had been before the First World War, which was the last big period of globalization. The production system of the world in the process was completely transformed. Capital, of course, moved immensely freely across the entire world in vast flows of all kinds. We achieved an extraordinary degree of integration. This led to and was associated with huge geopolitical changes. I've already mentioned the progressive rise in China, which became far more significant only in the more recent period. But the other really huge one, of course, was the fall of the Soviet Union. And the belief, Francis Fukuyama famously talked about this, that we were at the end of history, that democratic capitalism, if you like, our system, had conquered the world. Now, there were obviously other important developments of this period. This was the time when we began to realize how profoundly information and communication technology was changing the world. That indeed is in large part what allowed the integration of our goods sectors so profoundly, the unbundling of production chains of across the world, the supply chain phenomenon that we've got so familiar with really started as a result of that. But there were also some real downsides in this period. Productivity started to do not really very well, or that was already clear in the late 70s and 80s. It's been a paradox. I think it's an explicable one, but it's a paradox that while technology has moved forward so much, productivity has not done so. Now, the problem this creates is obvious. It means that for a very large part of the population in the developed world, the standards of living have not risen very much. In addition, again, in the developed world, inequality has risen a great deal in many countries, particularly in the US, but also to some degree in the UK and other countries. And this has started to make people feel pretty concerned and started to create the conditions for a populist backlash, and we've seen this against trade. It wasn't really a big thing in the period from 78 to 2007, but you could see a beginning of a concern about what was happening to our society. Then let's just move on then to the next big section of what I want to talk about, what I call the era of shocks, the period from 2007 to 2022. Perhaps there's a couple of other things I have to mention about that prior period. Of course, it was the era when we began to be really aware of the sustainability question. Not much done about it. There would be lots of discussion, but people began to be really aware of it. And the second thing that I should remind you of is the era of financialization, along with globalization, with enormous expansion in debt and credit. Now, so this was where we were in 2007. And in 2007 began what I think of as the era of shocks. And one of them is directly related to what I just talked about, this enormous expansion of credit and debt, associated with a really rather remarkable phenomenon, the export of capital, particularly from China to the West. This created the conditions, and I've argued this in my book, The Shifts and the Shocks, which looked at the financial crisis, for an extraordinary credit and housing boom in much of the West, which blew up. It's a complicated story about how, but it had immensely important political consequences. There are very few events that make clear to a population that the people in charge really don't know what they're doing. But a financial crisis is one of them. Suddenly, the core of the financial system on which they rely, which they trust, seems to be just breaking up in front of their eyes. They don't understand why. They also see governments coming to the rescue in an enormous scale, and that indeed happened. But the governments didn't necessarily come to their rescue. So I think the populist pressure that was already there because of the impact of globalization, the so-called China shock in the United States, as a lot of industrial jobs were lost, this deindustrialization, which happened in so many countries, was suddenly reinforced by the perception of this collapse of the financial system rescued by the government. This is a loss of trust, a loss of confidence in the elites in charge, had very profound consequences. It means that once you stop believing in elites, then populist politicians come along and say the elites can't be trusted at all. You should reject the elites of the left, the university-educated elites, the commercial elites. Trust in me. Just trust in me. And of course, whatever I say, and you could see this happening, in my view, it's pretty obvious in the US with the election of Donald Trump and also in the Brexit campaign here. This breakup of politics, the old established orders and elite of elites, was transformed in a new era of populism, mutual suspicion, of course, reinforced by another aspect of our new technologies, namely the new media. Now, I've talked about an era of shocks, and there have, of course, been two more very, very big ones in just the last 3 years. The pandemic, COVID, and now the Ukraine-Russia war and the clear emergence of what seemed to be two opposing blocs. COVID was not, in a way, it was a shock. And it was a surprise that it happened then, as it were, but we've known for a long time that pandemics were possible, possibly even likely. But we never knew quite what it would be like, and we didn't know how it would hit us. The interesting thing about COVID is that its economic impact in the short run was much bigger than people would have expected. There have been analysis of pandemics before, but nobody expected such deep recessions. But on the same time, the governments did, particularly in the developed world, not in the developed world, come to the rescue in a very, very big way. And above all, the vaccination program was much quicker and much more successful than most people expected. So one has to regard COVID as a success, the treatment of COVID as a success. But meanwhile, the Ukraine-Russia war and the tacit backing by China of Russia has made very clear the other huge development in the era of shocks, which is the emergence of an increasingly hostile relation between the two superpowers, with the US and the emergent superpower China, shown in the election of Donald Trump, continued under Joe Biden, a bipartisan agreement on that China is an enemy. And of course, it's probable that Russia would not have started the war in Ukraine without Chinese tacit backing. This, of course, has enormously increased the economic problems of the world, exacerbated the inflation that came out of COVID already, created an energy shock, an inflation shock, and a food shock across the world. And finally, as I said, we become aware of the climate issue very significantly before 2007. We already had the Kyoto conference in 92, but we have become increasingly aware that we're not actually, despite all the words, getting on top of it. And a very significant part of the younger generation are feeling that those in charge are bequeathing a planet with unmanageable and irreversible climate disaster baked in. So the era of shocks has been very traumatic. And now we are, to look at the third section I want to talk about, where we are now, what we have to do. We are in what is being called a polycrisis, or the great unraveling. What I think of as a great unraveling? The immediate, we have the energy, food, and inflation shocks. We have a possibly temporary, maybe not end, of the long years of free money with the associated huge financial risks. Nobody knows quite how long that will last. I think inflation will be brought under control, but the risks are very, very significant. So with this sudden transformation of the world financial environment, we, of course, have the obvious risks of superpower conflict and the concern that deglobalization, which has been avoided since the financial crisis, globalization just stopped. It didn't reverse. The question is it going to go into reverse? What will it mean if we try to go for friendshoring or bringing supply chains back home? Is any of that realistic? Nobody really knows. But we do know that the World Trade Order and the World Trade Organization has not really functional. And of course, people are really concerned about the risk of war. We've already got it in Ukraine, and there's a lot of concern. Well, what will happen with Taiwan? So what do we have to do? I think we have to understand, and this is a world leadership problem in which everybody is involved, we have to sustain global public goods. We have a common responsibility for achieving a sustainable economic system, a sustainable planet, preserving peace, and that means preserving cooperation. We cannot afford anything like a repetition of what happened during the earlier years of the last century, which was 45 years of disaster. I've noted in a recent column that when we look back at what went wrong in the past, it's pretty clear that the thing that really destroyed the integrated global economies is not normal protection, it's not normal political stresses, it's geopolitical disaster. The two world wars, the Great Depression, destroyed the integrated world economy, destabilized the entire world, and of course, the wars themselves were catastrophes. We have to sustain a basically cooperative world order. And it's not quite clear now whether that can be done, but it has to be a dominant priority for the world's leaders. I was very encouraged to see Biden and Xi talking to each other. There has to be a lot of talk. However difficult the current public crisis may be, nothing will be resolved without agreement to cooperate while differing with one another. We have to accept and tolerate differences. Meanwhile, of course, within the Western world, the broadly defined world of democratic capitalism, there is a really important challenges, particularly in a world where autocracy, far from what Frank Fukuyama hoped, has been an increasingly potent threat. Many countries have chosen or had foisted upon them autocratic rulers. Democracy as a system is, in the famous words of Larry Diamond, a very well-known authority on democracy. Democracy is in recession. And of course, China is becoming a very assertive presence and a considerably more autocratic system than many of us hoped or expected 10 or 12 years ago. So stabilizing democracy, making democracy work, making democracy successful, which hinges, I think, above all on making the population of our societies have a restored trust in their leaders. And by their leaders, I don't mean just their political leaders. I'm also talking about their intellectual, social, and business leaders. Without trust in the leadership, the elite of a society, it is actually impossible for it to be stable, because it's not that people stop trusting in anything. What happens instead, if they stop trusting those in charge, is they will trust in anything. And then we have a breakdown of any possibility of reaching a common conception of what the public good is, which is an essential ingredient for a successful democratic world. So where we are now is a world of enormous challenges, some of them technical, how we deal with monetary policy, how we deal with disease, things of this kind. But they're fundamentally political challenges at the global level, cooperating in difference, and political challenges at the domestic level in the democratic order. And how we respond to those challenges will determine what the world looks like 10 years from now.
Thank you very much, Martin. Such a succinct and great background to where we find ourselves today. And indeed, we have many challenges that stand out. And I think, to me, what stands out from this is really the confluence of challenges that most of us, most of the working age population, haven't really had to face before. Future leaders are clearly dealing with a very different set of risks and a very different environment. How do we prepare the leaders to navigate these future challenges?